Loving about it. Love seeks the ultimate good of the loved one. Homosexual behavior does the opposite. If you really love somebody, you would not have homosexual intercourse with them, because it's not helping them. It is not healthy. It's medically dangerous, as we pointed out last time. In fact, most sexual contact that occurs in society is unloving. Think about it. There's a lot of sexual contact going on between parents and kids. Unloving. Between spouses and extramarital affairs. Unloving. Outside of marriage, you may think it's loving. It's not. If you really love somebody, you'd commit to them. Most sexual contact that occurs in society is unloving. In fact, there is some sexual contact inside a traditional marriage that's unloving. For example, when it's medically dangerous, when somebody's injured or hurt, it's unloving. And think about it this way. What if you sexualized every relationship you had? Think about people you love. In your family, your friends. You love all these people, right? What if you sexualized every relationship you had? What would happen? It would be a disaster. Sex is meant to be channeled into a very narrow window, a very narrow channel between a man and a woman inside of marriage at the right time. It's not meant to be outside of it. When that happens, it's like fire. It's got to be in a fireplace. If it gets into the rest of your house, it destroys everything. That's what sex does if it's not in the fireplace. Most of our loving relationships are non-sexual. But there are healthy, long-term same-sex couples. I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't know about you, but when I look at that picture, I get the cooties. Okay? That is the moral law rising up in us. There's something, when you look at that, you go, there's something not right about that. The moral intuition you have is true. First of all, the data show that they are the exception rather than the rule, and laws must be based on the rule, not the exception. You hear this all the time in Congress. Congress people are notorious for doing that. They come up with one exception and they try and create a whole law around the exception. Exceptions make bad laws. If we had to base our laws on exceptions, we would have to endorse smoking because some smokers outlive non-smokers. You notice that? I mean, you could be the total athlete, you could be working out every day, and then you might drop dead, and the guy living next door who's been a couch potato and smoking filterless Camels for his whole life outlives you. So therefore, we ought to endorse smoking. No! It's the exception rather than the rule. Also, we would have to endorse drunk driving because some drunk drivers don't hurt anyone. It's true, right? We all go, no, that's not right. Yeah, it's not right. And so we ought not endorse same-sex marriage because you might find a couple somewhere that seems to be doing okay, at least externally anyway, and has been together for a long time, and they don't seem to be hurting anybody. Seem, I said. So we ought to create an entire social policy about the exceptions? No. Well, you keep talking about how marriage has to do with children, but you know, some marriages don't produce children. So, if marriage is about children, you ought not let a man and a woman get married unless they're going to have children, which means all you old folk who are going to get married can't get married, and if you're sterile, you can't get married either. Let's be consistent here, right? Answer, again, they are the exception rather than the rule, but the rule is that no same-sex couple can procreate. There are no exceptions to that, not in a natural way anyway. Also, childless traditional marriage can provide a mom and a dad to adopted children, and some have children from previous relationships. And childless traditional marriages still affirm what is generally a procreative relationship. When you see a man and a woman together, that affirms a procreative relationship. It does not if you see a man or a woman and a woman. And of course, it's not going to be the state's business to try and figure out whether someone's sterile or not, or whether they can have kids or not. They just say, we're going to endorse marriage all around, and if they have kids, great. If they don't, that's okay too. So their objection, the same-sex marriage people's objection, fails. What about divorce? You, Christians, You keep talking about same-sex marriage out there, and your own closet is full of skeletons. Divorce. And you know what? They're absolutely right. Do you hear a lot of sermons on divorce? You should. Problem is, a lot of people would clear out and not give their money then, right? But God says, I hate divorce. Why do you think God hates divorce? Because first of all, it illustrates the relationship that He has with the church. But secondly, because He knows of the disastrous consequences it has on the two people who get divorced, and more importantly, the kids. So yeah, we can plead guilty to that. We've failed when it comes to marriage. And we ought to do everything we can to keep our marriages together and to live in a true Christian marriage. We've degraded marriage by liberalizing divorce laws, we agree, but that's not an argument for same-sex marriage. In fact, it's an argument against it. Why? Because it shows that the vast social problems from the weakening of marriage laws through divorce show us how important the law is to the health of the family and the nation, and why we should not weaken marriage further by legalizing same-sex marriage. In other words, when we changed the law like we did back in the 60s, we actually got terrible results in the generations that followed, the 40 or 50 years that's followed. The law does affect our health. And that's why we ought not change the law to elevate same-sex relationships to that of traditional relationships. The law will create a problem if we do that. What we ought to do is strengthen our marriage laws, make divorce harder, rather than weakening marriage further by putting same-sex marriage on the same level. Now, before I move on to the last point here, I want to point out that sometimes the objection, why are you singling out homosexuality, is brought up, and we need to answer it. First of all, I don't speak on homosexuality a lot. I'm speaking about other issues all the time. But this is an issue we need to speak out on. They say, why don't you speak against adultery? Or why don't you speak against divorce? Or why don't you speak against some of these other things? Theft, Enron, all these things. Well, we do speak against those. But there's a big, major difference between those issues and this issue. What's the major difference? Yeah, no one's trying to make the others and trying to promote the others to the government. In other words, there's not an adultery movement out there, right? There's not a big divorce movement out there. Although a lot of people get divorced, most people think it's a tragedy. There are not people out there trying to legalize theft. But there are people out there who are trying to say that same-sex marriage is not only something the government ought to allow, it ought to promote. I mean, we're not the ones who brought this issue to the table. The homosexual activists are. Now, let me just point out some questions you can ask. You probably can't remember, I can't remember all these answers to these objections, so just here's a few questions you can ask when it comes to this issue. You might ask a question like this: are all kinds of sexual contact the same? Is sexual contact ever unhealthy and or unloving? Well, yes, of course. All these questions get at an objection they bring up. How about, are people ever born with conditions that are not normal and sometimes harmful? Yes. Everybody knows that. So why are you saying that your condition, even if you were born with it, is something that we ought to endorse? How about, is there any difference between sexual desires, which is sometimes called orientation, and sexual behavior? You seem to try and conflate the two. You try and say, because you have the desire, therefore you ought to do the behavior. You ought to have the behavior. Why? How about, should people act on every desire they have? Question we brought up before. Must the government recognize every desire people have as a right? Because you have a desire, does the government have to make it a right and endorse it and give financial benefits to it? Are children usually better off with a mom and a dad, or is parenting irrelevant to their development? Ask the question. What are they going to say?